Hello, everybody. So we're going to have our weekly talk about what's going on. First thing going on is Angela Walker won't be with us today. She's going to pull back from the podcast. She's got ridiculous hours working construction, got family and personal issues to take care of. So she's stepping back for a while. So she won't be with us today. But, we had a good talk today about some of the issues. And, it's what I talked about last week. This democracy crisis in this country is accelerating. Like I said, the ruthless Republicans are out in the states passing not just voter suppression laws, but laws to steal elections. They are down in Georgia. They are getting Democratic and particularly black members of county boards of elections removed. They've disempowered the independently elected Secretary of State so that legislature can count the votes and certify elections. They're doing that in Arizona, in Texas, in Florida. They're setting it up to steal elections. This is the old Jim Crow. This is, what they did to overthrow Reconstruction and establish, basically one-party states in the South, the Dixiecrats. And here we are, more than 100 years later, 150 years later, and that's what we face. But the thing I would say is, we can't rely on Congress. I mean, it's pathetic to watch the feckless Democrats get rolled by the ruthless Republicans on this. They can't get their votes together or to modify the filibuster so they can get that For the People Act passed. Of course, the Greens had criticisms of their public financing matching funds program, but there were a lot of good measures in there to set federal standards for easier access to the ballot, disclosure of dark money, a number of things, ethics reforms, like requiring presidential candidates to disclose their tax forms. But they're not getting any of that passed because they can't get around a filibuster, which, we know about Manchin and Sinema, but Washington Post had an article about June 4th, I think, where they went through about a dozen Democrats who really don't want to get rid of the filibuster. So we're stuck with that, but that doesn't mean there aren't things we can't do. Right now, Greens are fighting for ballot access, get back on the ballot. We just succeeded in Arkansas. Got a number of signatures before a new law that the Arkansas legislature passed and the governor signed to increase the number of signatures from 1,000 to 5,000. But they got the 1,000 in before the law changed just last week. So congratulations to the Arkansas Green Party. I know a number of states are out there petitioning. Missouri, for example. We're going to have a big fight here in New York next year. We basically got to get 90,000 signatures in 6 weeks to be safely back on the ballot. These are things that everybody can help out with, whether they do the petitioning or they can just contribute to the funding for the petition drive. So that's one thing we can work on. And as I've been saying, we got a movement for ranked choice voting going on in this country. Since the election, Burlington, Vermont, Austin, Texas, 23 cities and towns, including Salt Lake City and Utah, are going to ranked choice voting. We just had a ranked choice voting primary for the mayor of New York City and the other citywide offices and the city council seats. And you'll see a lot of right-wing commentary from the Heritage Foundation and American Enterprise Institute about how it was a mess. Ranked choice voting wasn't a mess. It was the New York City Board of Elections, which is a nest of nepotism and patronage and has made a lot of messes of elections in the past. You may remember when something like 200,000 people in Brooklyn, where Bernie Sanders would have got a lot of votes, were removed from the voting rolls in 2016. So that's just one of many scandals. So what that says, and this is a reform we should be fighting for, we need nonpartisan administration of elections by independent agencies. What other credible democracy in the world has the governing parties administering their own elections? And because we do that, that opens the door for the Republicans to set up this partisan administration they're trying to do in the states they control. So that should be part of our demands. I had an article in Counterpunch on July 2nd that went through 8 reforms that we should be fighting for in a pro-democracy agenda. One of them is nonpartisan administration of elections, fair ballot access, RCV and proportional representation, abolish the Senate, abolish the Electoral College and replace it with a ranked choice national popular vote for president, full public campaign financing, and an amendment to the U.S. Constitution that citizens have a constitutional right to vote. That's not in the U.S. Constitution. As we know from Bush v. Gore, where the Supremes infamously said, you don't have a constitutional right to vote for electors for president. There are provisions in the Constitution that say you can't discriminate on the basis of race or sex, but they don't say you got a right to vote. We need that in the Constitution to enforce all these other measures in the courts and enable Congress to enact regulations of states, of elections that are administered in the states, so they're fair and open to everybody. So there's a whole agenda there. The article was called Voting Rights Include the Right to Vote for Who You Want. And what I meant by that was, first, we got to have fair ballot access. Ballot access in this country is off the charts. You want to run as an independent for Congress, in most states, it's thousands or tens of thousands of signatures. You want to do it to run for the House of Commons in the UK, it's 10 signatures. You want to run for Parliament in New Zealand, it's 2 signatures. You want to run for a Parliament in Canada, it's 100 signatures. Except in those northern rural ridings, that's what they call their districts, it's 50 signatures. Here it's thousands or tens of thousands. So fair ballot access is one of those reforms we got to push. So that's to say, yeah, we're in a democracy crisis, but there are many things we can do now. And the point I was getting to is the right to vote for who you want. It's not just ballot access, it's single member plurality voting, where whoever gets the plurality gets all the representation. So if you're a Green or a Libertarian or a Socialist and you don't get the plurality, you get no representation. And same for a major party in a district where they're the minority of the 2 major parties. They don't get any representation. Their voters don't, under single member plurality voting. It's winner take all, which means most people don't get represented, which is why most elections, the non-voters are the biggest block of voters, because they know voting won't change anything. 90% of our congressional districts and 95% of our state legislative districts are uncompetitive. They are effectively one-party districts. So there's a lot we can do to change that. And in that regard, that's ranked choice voting for multi-member districts. That's how you get proportional representation. There's federal legislation just got reintroduced last month called the Fair Representation Act, but it only has 15 sponsors. So you might want to raise that with your member of Congress and with the public. But that's the kind of thing we got to fight for. And we've been winning it at the local level. We can win it then at the state level and finally the federal level. So ballot access and ranked choice voting and proportional representation are things we can work on. And then, we got another heat wave. We see climate chaos. It's striking home. But again, Congress can't seem to get out of its own way. Sanders, as I think he said or somebody commented, he's got to deal with 50 Joe Manchins, because it's every one of those members of the Senate wants something out of this bill, and they don't all agree. So he's got to navigate that. Same thing with his counterpart, Yarmouth, in the House. He's got 435 people to deal with, and they all got the same leverage because, well, a little bit less leverage in the House. Is a 4-seat margin for the Democrats now. But all those people have, basically a veto until they get what they want. So that Schumer says they're going to work out this month. We'll see. But, our big problem from our point of view is, even if we got what Sanders and the progressive Democrats want, which is a Keynesian Green New Deal, which means we're contracting with the same corporations that got us into this mess to build the green alternatives. And we're doing it based on their ability or their judgment that they can make a profit by making those investments with whatever incentives and tax breaks and contracts the federal government gives them, which means it's not coordinated. And that's not going to get it done in the time frame we need to. That's why we've been talking about an eco-socialist Green New Deal, where we do like we did during World War II, when the federal government took over a quarter of the manufacturing capacity of the country, to turn our manufacturing sector into the arsenal of democracy so we could defeat the fascists, and did it, very quickly. That's the kind of thing we got to do through public ownership and planning to get the coordination of retrofitting buildings, mass transit, producing things that use a lot of carbon now, like steel and cement, in ways that don't produce carbon. Of course, producing our electricity without carbon. Coordinating all that, because they have to be integrated. And if we leave it to the market and incentives like is in Biden's plan, and all the progressive Democrats want to do is throw more money in that same way, it's not going to get it done. So we have issues there. We're probably we're not going to get what we need, even if they do get an infrastructure bill passed. But again, there are things we can do now. And where we just had a victory on the Keystone XL pipeline. Now we got to stop Enbridge Line 3 in Minnesota, Enbridge Line 5 in Michigan, the Dakota Access Pipeline, the Mountain Valley Pipeline. There are pipelines all over the country where we can basically stop this new fossil fuel infrastructure. Because once it's built, the investors want to milk that for what it's worth for decades. And we're locked into fossil fuel burning in a climate catastrophe. So I know it's a difficult situation to watch what's going on, but there are fights that we can engage in and win. So I guess that's my thought to start this discussion off. So I look forward to your questions and comments. Scout Trooper 164, what is causing the most change to the climate? Carbon emissions, fossil fuel burning. That's just the straight science. So, and of course, what's causing the fossil fuel burning? You got a capitalist system that's based on endless growth. For every firm in that economy, they got to grow or die if they want to stay in business. So you have a dynamic of endless growth. So the structural incentives built into capitalism are for growth and fossil fuel burning. So that's why we need system change to stop climate change. Go, 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 1, 2, 3. Do you think Biden will win re-election in 2024? I think it's too early to predict. I think he's in trouble. Because the Democrats can't get their act together, we have partisan gerrymandering going on in the 30 states where the Republicans control both houses of the legislature, state legislature, and they are drawing the lines to get themselves overrepresented. I think these are the right numbers because of the 2010 redistricting the Republicans did in Wisconsin. In the last election, Democrats got 54% of the votes for statewide for the assembly, but only 38% of the seats because of this partisan gerrymandering biased the districts, so the Republicans got overrepresented. That's going to go on all over the country. The estimates of the people that do this sort of thing is that just by gerrymandering alone, the Republicans are going to gain 15 to 20 seats in the 2022 election. And with a 4-seat difference between the Democrats and Republicans now in the House, that means the Republicans are going to take back the House, which means as dismal as Biden getting things through this term is, it'll be impossible the next term. So what's he going to run on in 2024? And then you have the election theft laws being set up by the Republicans in the states, which when it gets to the Congress to certify the election, the Republicans can do what they tried to do this year, and that is not certify elections in states they lost. So Biden might even win the election and get it stolen from him. That's this crisis of democracy we're facing. And I think, for us, Biden's going to do what he's going to do. The Democrats are going to do what they're going to do. The question is, what are we going to do? And we really got to build the Green Party as an alternative from the bottom up and then fight for these election changes, ranked choice voting, proportional representation. So we get our fair share of representation. We're at least a 20% party. If we had the Fair Representation Act passed by Congress, so we had proportional representation in the House from the states, we'd have, what's 20%? We'd have like 80 Greens in the House of Representatives. That would reflect what's out here in the public. The single-member plurality voting system with the Republicans now, not just conservative, but extremist, authoritarian, racist. Most progressives feel they got to vote for the Democrats defensively to stop the Republicans, which makes it really hard for us. And that flows from the single-member plurality voting system. So that's why I think we need to start really fighting to change the rules of elections so they're fair and everybody gets their fair share of representation, every political viewpoint. Scout Trooper 164 asks, when did problems with elections such as unfair voting begin? Well, we've had that in this country from the beginning. Originally, it was only white men with property could vote. And during the American Revolution, the non-property working people busted into town meetings and got a franchise there for a while. But it really wasn't until what they call the Jacksonian era, about the 1820s, where they dropped the property qualifications in most of the states. I mean, some states, Vermont came in, they didn't have a property qualification. But so you had that. And then you had the fight for Black people to get their vote. That took a civil war in the 15th Amendment. And then that was undermined by the Jim Crow laws that, the Dixiecrats in the South and also the industrialists in the North. They made it harder to vote because they didn't want these European immigrants, working class people voting in the North. So, by the turn of the century, 1900, voting participation went down because it made it harder to vote across the board. Jim Crow was aimed at Black folks in the South, but it disenfranchised half the white folks, poor white folks mainly, because of the poll tax and literacy tests. So there was that fight. There was the women's suffrage movement, which, goes back to the abolitionist movement, and they didn't get that passed until 1918. And then we had Jim Crow. We got the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965, reauthorized several times. Now it's being undermined by the Supreme Court and the Republicans in the Congress. So we're fighting that same fight we fought in the second half of the 1900s. So, and then all along it's been single member plurality voting, when most of the rest of the world has moved to proportional systems. And that's a victory of the working class. That's what they fought for, to get their proportional share of representation, in Western Europe in particular. And we're way behind. And then we have counter-majoritarian institutions like the U.S. Senate and the Electoral College that mean what the majority of people want doesn't get reflected in the U.S. Senate or in the presidential elections. 19 out of 50 presidential elections since 1824, when they tallied the popular vote for the first time, the president was elected by a plurality, not a majority. And 5 of those times, the guy that came in second became the president. Most recently, Donald Trump. So, yeah, we've had problems with voting all along. They began at the start. Nair Silu. How do we fight against the propaganda that socialism is bad? I think he means, how do we fight? I think we patiently explain. Most people, when they hear socialism and think it's bad, they think it's anti-democratic. And there were countries that called themselves socialists that were very oppressive. Whether it's, Hitler had the word, National Workers' Socialist Party or whatever it was, Nazis. The Stalinist states, they used the term socialism, and it was anti-democratic. But historically, traditionally, socialism was about extending democracy into the economy. And on that basis, securing political democracy. Because if you have concentrated wealth, that translates into concentrated political power. So even if you have elections, the people with the money rule the elections. Whereas if you have a social society where distribution of income is according to the work you do, not to the property you own, distribution is going to be much more equitable. And so we'll have political equality. So socialism is about democracy. That's the way I fight against it. I say we want more democracy. We want people to be able to have a say in the decisions that affect their lives. And that's not just elections for government officials. That's at work. Most corporations are, tyrannies. They're dictatorships. You have no say. You just work as directed. And then the same thing with the broader economic decisions. Who decides whether we're going to go solar or nuclear? When that decision was made in the 50s in the Eisenhower administration, there was a commission called the Paley Commission, which the Truman administration had authorized. They were worried about running out of oil. So they were trying to figure out what comes next. And the Paley Commission recommended solar. But the Eisenhower administration said nuclear, because it was part of building up the nuclear arms, and there was an industry lobby there. But the point is, that decision was not put up to the people to decide. That was decided, it wasn't even decided by Congress. It was decided by the military-industrial complex itself. Very undemocratic. So I think when we talk about socialism, we should talk about we want more democracy, economic democracy, as well as political democracy. Hey, Zeke Kramer, how do we respond to the right trying to overthrow the election in Peru? Well, obviously we oppose it. We have to expose what's her name? Fujimori is the one that lost. She's doing like Trump did, saying it was fraudulent without evidence, trying to hold up the final count and certification. And we got to speak out against that, and particularly the United States or its proxies like the Organization of American States getting in the middle of that. So I think right now we just got to speak out against it. The left won, and let them take office. Daniel Restless Pen, solidarity from the newly formed left-green movement in Nigeria. Solidarity back. I didn't know one had been formed, but I'm definitely going to look it up. There are left-green movements, particularly in Europe, that have been doing well. We just had the indigenous-based party, it's Inuit language, I can't say it, win the majority of the Greenland parliament. We have a left-green who is prime minister of Iceland, and we have strong representation from left-greens across Scandinavia. We just had an election in, I think it was Slovenia. I think Zagreb. Is that Slovenia or Croatia? Anyway, a left-green party won their elections in Zagreb. So good luck in Nigeria, and I'm gonna check out the left-green movement in Nigeria. Ms. Leo, in this world, we can never run out of water. Why do you think people are putting in people's minds the fake fear of scarcity? Is it to have a big cash transfer to water companies and water CEOs? Well, water scarcity is an issue, certainly in the Western United States, certainly because industrial agriculture draws down aquifers, so we can run out of water to irrigate agriculture. And then, of course, the water wars, the Cochabamba, hope I pronounced that right, Bolivia water wars, where Bechtel, they privatized the water, and then the people couldn't get access to it. So private ownership of a common inheritance, the water of the world, is a big problem, because then the private owners want to make it scarce so they can charge us an arm and a leg to get a drink of water or take a shower. So we should not run out of water. There's enough water to go around if it's fairly distributed and we maintain good infrastructure for it in a sustainable way. But we can't privatize it. And that's a concern with this bipartisan infrastructure bill that Biden is touting as this bipartisan thing. It is being financed by privatization of public assets. And that could include water systems that are now municipal. So we got to watch that. Ms. Leo, what does the murder of Haiti's president mean for us and the world and the people like us in Haiti? Well, first of all, it doesn't improve a very difficult situation, probably makes it worse. For us, meaning the United States, I think it means we need to stay out and let the Haitians work that out amongst themselves. We have a terrible record going back to the coup against Aristide, and then him being returned during the Clinton years on the condition he adopted neoliberal austerity policies. He had been overthrown by the right wing because he was doing things like raising the minimum wage. And then we were part of a UN peacekeeping group that totally abused their responsibilities, got people sick with cholera. There was a lot of sex trafficking and involvement with that force. So those forces have no credibility with the people of Haiti and haven't done them any good. And I mean, U.S. involvement in Haiti goes back to early part of the 20th century. The Marines went in there after their president was assassinated and stayed for like 20 years and basically ran it on behalf of our business interests. So the U.S. should stay out. And what it means for the world and people like us in Haiti, I mean, people like us being the average working people, they have a tall task ahead of them. They've got to pull together an alternative, and there's been a long struggle between the right wing elite, Papa Doc, and all that kind of repression, and more popular movements like Aristide and others have represented, and that struggle goes on. And I think we got to be in solidarity with the exploited and oppressed, give them our best. But as far as institutional involvement by anything from the United States at this point, other than charity and aid to feed hungry people, that kind of thing, I don't think we have a role. It's up to the Haitians. Kenneth O'Connor, do you think Biden is going to escalate conflict in Syria as troops come out of Afghanistan? No, I don't think he's going to escalate. He will add to the bombing that Israel already does at the Iranian militias in Syria. But that'll only be in retaliation to them attacking our forces, which has mainly been in Iraq. He's going to maintain the status quo, which is keeping some troops in the oil fields, which he shouldn't be doing, and giving arms to the Kurds who fought ISIS and now are fighting a Turkish invasion. What Biden ought to do is tell the Turks to get the hell out of Syria and leave the Kurds alone. And the way he ought to engage is diplomatically. There have been discussions that Russia, Syria, Iran, Turkey have been involved in, and under Trump, the U.S. pulled out. I mean, diplomacy can hopefully dampen down the conflict, but that's, again, a very difficult situation. It's a civil war with more than a dozen outside countries involved, which makes it very complicated and a total disaster for the people of Syria. But I don't think he's going to escalate troop involvement in Syria. I don't see any reason for him to do that. He just maintain the current policy. Andy Messick, my state Green Party just had elections for chairs, etc., and now is having a lot of grievances for a turf that's a trans-exclusive radical feminist. Possibility won the co-chair position and delegate to the convention, along with a lot of other infighting. What advice would you have to move forward? Well, first of all, people need to talk to each other, not around each other. And instead of making factional moves, they got to resolve this face to face. And that's how democracy works. You gotta deal with the decisions people made. And if you have a political problem with that, make it an issue of political discussion. But I think what we don't want to do is basically say other people are beyond the pale and we can't work with them, and that just makes it worse. There are people like that you got to deal with, but usually if people talk to each other and try to stick to a democratic process and accept that, that's the best you can do, even if you don't always like the results. I often am on the losing end of votes in the New York State Committee, so that doesn't mean I walk away or denounce the people on the other side as having bad faith. Scout Trooper 164, do you think our never-ending wars are part of the reason for climate change? Yeah, certainly they are. A lot of these are wars for oil, going back to the Carter Doctrine, which was basically, we'll fight for the oil in the Middle East. So we depended on oil. Military was the way we secured the oil, and burning all that oil is why we got this climate crisis. So yeah, that's why we got to get off. Well, we got to stop fighting wars for oil. We really don't do that now because of fracking. We're producing enough oil domestically. But, you know, the military industrial complex is integrated with these big oil companies. So even if we're not importing oil, we're protecting the assets of US-based global corporations overseas. And so that's part of the reason we're still in these wars for oil. Amy L. Stacks, Howie, has the National Committee made an official statement about the rush to reopen the country in the wake of the new virus variants and the CDC's poor response to them? Thanks. The National Green Party has not, as far as I'm aware. But you're raising a big, important question, because this Delta variant, especially the Delta Plus, is sweeping through states like Arkansas and Missouri, where people have been in COVID denial or vaccine denial, and now they're getting slammed. And there were reports this week that if you got the Pfizer vaccination, which I got, it may not protect you from the Delta variant, or there may need to be a booster. Now the CDC is saying not yet. Pfizer just starting this, but that's a possibility on the horizon. So if that is a possibility, I'll tell you one thing, I'm wearing my mask when I go out into the stores and whatnot, even though most people have stopped doing that. I think it's better to be safe than sorry. So anyway, the National Party hasn't made a statement, but you know, my statement is keep the social distancing, the masks, and watch the news on vaccinations, and don't take this Delta variant lightly. It's, you know, Japan, the UK, they're shutting down a lot of countries. Vietnam, you know, was very successful until recently when this Delta variant came in. They're very successful in keeping cases low. So we're not out of the woods. And plus, because of vaccine apartheid, as they call it, we have not really put resources into exporting vaccines to poor countries. So COVID's running rampant and mutating into these new variants that our vaccines may not be able to protect us from going forward. So we're not out of the woods on this COVID thing, and people need to keep their guard up, and public policy needs to change. We need to, what was it, when Biden, at the G8 or G7, Biden pledged, or the G7 pledged, I think it was 500 million vaccinations they would get to the poor countries at a time when the World Health Organization was saying we need 13 billion to vaccinate the world and protect us from COVID. You know, we spend all this on the military to protect us, but for much less cost, we could do much more protection by getting the vaccinations out there, or the vaccines out there, and we're not doing that. So yeah, COVID is still a problem and could get worse again. Z. Kramer asks, how do we fight for mass public transportation on the local level? That's one of those expenses that local tax bases, for the most part, can't sustain. That requires progressive federal taxation, and we should be taxing wealth, estates, income, corporate income on a progressive basis So we have the resources to help have mass public transit in all localities. So the best we can do is fight for more money into public transportation as opposed to roads in localities. Fight for expanding public transportation, usually by bonding and borrowing. We have a big issue with, whenever this comes up in a lot of cities, the white suburbs don't want the cosmopolitan, multiracial inner city being able to get to the suburbs. And a lot of times these lines, I think of Atlanta, for example, the lines stop at the city border. We got to fight that. Among other reasons, because suburban sprawl is an ecological and climate disaster. We need to be building walkable, bikeable, compact communities that use resources and energy much more efficiently. And mass transit is part of the way to build those kind of communities, so that within a particular walkable, bikeable community, you can get to work and shops and stores and entertainment and your residence on your feet or on a bike. But when you want to go to other communities, mass transit. I was on a podcast the other day about reimagining green transportation. And I recalled a book from Ivan Illich in 1974 called Energy and Equity. And he observed that as mechanized transportation got above 15 miles per hour, which basically meant trains and then automobiles, people actually didn't move any faster. They spent a lot more time traveling, and there were stretches where they could go fast. But because of traffic and everybody being in their own vehicles, they actually don't move any faster than they would if they were on a bike. But they use a lot more energy. They're a lot more isolated and alienated from each other. So that that low-tech solution, the bike, is really the best way to get around along with your feet in communities if we design them around that mode of transportation rather than the individual car. That's my big critique of Biden's transportation plan. It's all about electric vehicles. We're going to swap out internal combustion engines for electric engines and still have everybody running around in their own personal car. That is an ecological disaster. There's all kinds of minerals that limit the amount of electric vehicles and renewable energy we can produce: lithium, cobalt, copper, other minerals. And if we continue to build transportation around individual vehicles, we're going to have a problem finding the resources, and we'll just be wasting resources. So we can be a lot more efficient by having walkable, bikeable communities supported by mass transit. So that gets into zoning. I mean, that's another issue with mass transit. We got to stop this zoning where, the warehouses are over here and the factories are over there, and the downtown or the shops or the strip malls over here, and the homes and apartments are over there. Everything's separated. So you can't get anywhere but in a car. That's why we got to change zoning and planning. The planning should be done by us. It should be public planning. Right now, planning is done by the real estate industry and developers. And they go to the planning boards and get rubber stamped. And, the real estate industry runs most cities. So we've got to become the planners ourselves. And then we can contract out to the builders and bring in the building trades to build what we say we won't build, rather than them coming to us saying, what they do. They say, if you give us these tax breaks, we're going to give you these jobs and this tax base. And planning boards tend to rubber stamp that. That's the kind of politics that Green parties at the local level, it's a natural issue for them. So mass transit opens up the whole question of community design. So I think those are some of the ways we can fight for mass transit and a community design that mass transit can support. Go, 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 1, 2, 3. What do you think about Jimmy Carter and his presidency? Jimmy Carter was a creature of the Trilateral Commission, which was an elite corporate body that David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski pulled together Trilateral meant Western Europe, United States, and Japan. How are they going to rule the world? Jimmy Carter was unknown governor from Georgia, but he was close to Coca-Cola and some of those Atlanta companies, and they groomed him. There's a great book by a guy who's a Green, Larry Shoup, came out in the 70s called The Carter Presidency and Beyond. And he explains how the Trilateral Commission basically groomed and put Jimmy Carter into the presidency with the cooperation of the corporate media. So he got in there, and what we call Reaganism and neoliberalism, in other words, public austerity and state subsidies for private corporations and deregulation of markets, that started with Jimmy Carter. Deregulated trucking, gas, started the deregulation of the financial sector, gutted the Humphrey Hawkins full employment bill, which was a job guarantee bill, and increased the military budget, cut social domestic spending. The only thing Reagan did was accelerate that with the support of a majority Democratic Congress. This was bipartisan. So that's what Jimmy Carter did. And then I mentioned the Carter Doctrine. You know, he said, we'll fight for the oil in the Middle East. That's basically what that boiled down to. So I have a low opinion. He talked about, you know, a foreign policy based on human rights, but when there was massive repression of strikes in South Korea, he was totally with the dictator. At that time, South Korea had a dictator. So not a good presidency. As a man, I think he's a pretty decent man. Habitat for Humanity, the election monitoring. I think he's better now than when he was president. But his term in office was a turn to the right. We went from Democratic Party went from being liberal New Deal Democrats to being corporate New Democrats, as Bill Clinton later called them. Austin Whiteside, are there any mutual aid organizations or climate activist groups you'd recommend supporting, volunteering with? Well, I would look around my own community and see, you know, who the best ones are. I have political criticisms of a lot of the, you know, groups that have a national profile. I think most of them, they're too dependent on lobbying the Democrats. You know, I admire the Sunrise Movement, those young people that are getting out in the streets, they're raising their demands, but it's totally dependent on the Democratic Party. They threaten not to leave, which means, you know, the Bidens of the world can take them for granted, which he's doing. But they are, you know, they've raised the profile, they've educated a lot of young people, or given them a place to express their concerns about climate change, which they've educated themselves on. I have to say, when I, you know, speak to Sunrise Movement groups, for example, those young people are better educated on the science of climate change than their elders. I really respect that. So I think it just depends on who's doing what in your community. And I would also say that what we really need is a Green Party. We need not just single issue movements, but a party that brings the constituencies and the issues together around a common program where people can strategize together on how to advance that program so all the demands are addressed in a way where we support each other. If we remain single issue groups, we're competing for time, attention, and money. And that's not the best strategy. So I think get involved in those single issue groups, but also get involved in the Green Party. We need an independent party to the left. Otherwise, the Democrats are going to ignore their progressives inside their own party and tack to the right, going for swing voters. And the whole dynamic is to the right, chasing the Republicans who are off to the extreme right now. Scout Trooper 164. What do you think of the U.S. being granted unlimited appeal to Julian Assange? I think the court said they could appeal the decision that said Assange should not be extradited to the U.S. because basically he faced torture. That's what the judge said: solitary confinement, torturous conditions. And now the U.S. gets another crack at it in court. And I think that's terrible. I think Julian Assange should be freed, the charges dropped, and let him go about his life. He's a publisher, not a spy, and the Espionage Act is being abused. That act should be repealed. It dates from World War I, and they use it against whistleblowers, not spies. And then the whistleblowers can't go to court and say they release the information in the public interest. That defense is explicitly excluded by that espionage law. It's a kangaroo court kind of thing. It's shameful the United States has that law. So anyway, Assange should be freed and the charges dropped. Z. Kramer, do you think people 16 and older should have the right to vote? I do. And some communities do that for the school board elections. I think that's something that should be encouraged. I think it should be, when you get 16, we should have more civics in our high schools. It should be part of your civics education, getting ready to vote. And when you're that age, today it's climate change. For me, it was Vietnam. We had good reason to vote. When I was 16, I couldn't vote till I was 21. So they brought it down to 18. The world didn't end. I think 16 is a good age. Scout Trooper 164, speaking of transport, what do you think is the climate-free way to transport across the country? So I think what you're saying is, what is the most climate-friendly way across the country? I would say railroads, electrified rail. We should have a world-class rail system, high speed between cities, trolleys and light rail within cities. And then there are ways of doing air transport that doesn't release carbon, or at least recycles it, like with biofuels and the other fuels they're experimenting with. But except for, coast to coast or halfway across the country, high-speed rail is as quick as flying, and it's much more climate-friendly and resource and energy efficient. Juan, hello, a friend from Spain. You're an inspiration for the ecologists and the good people. Thank you for your working. Peace and love, friend. God bless you. Well, back at you. Good luck in Spain. I know there's an ecology movement. Not that familiar with the current political situation in Spain, but I know that all these issues that we face on climate and the environment and economic justice and all of them, it's got to be international. Capitalism's an international system. When we say system change, we're talking about changing the world system. So good luck in Spain. What novels or books do you recommend? Well, when I get to a novel, I disappear till I'm done. I don't read them that often because of that, because I wouldn't get anything else done. I think the last novel I read was about 12 years ago. It's called Freedom Road by Howard Fast. And it was basically a community of free slaves and also some poor whites tried to defend themselves from the destruction of Reconstruction. So anyway, I haven't read any novels lately. I'm reading a book on rent-share capitalism, which is basically the surplus being taken from us because of chronic stagnation in the economy and the lack of profitable outlets for productive investments in the real economy of making goods and services. Companies, particularly the financial sector, but also the real estate sector, are monopolizing assets and then charging us an arm and a leg to get access to them, whether it's housing or financing. And that's called economic rent. In other words, it's unearned income, not by producing something, but just because you own an asset that others need access to. So it's called Rent Your Capitalism. I think the author's name is Brent Stevens. I just finished a good book it's called A People's Green New Deal by Max Ajl, AJL. And it's a very good critique, similar to what I was saying earlier about the problem with the Keynesian kind of Green New Deals that we're getting from the progressive Democrats. The Thrive agenda that a lot of liberal environmental groups are pushing, they're saying we want 10 trillion over 10 years. And Sanders is saying, well, I want 6 trillion, that's what we can get, but he's probably going to settle for less. But all it is this Keynesian Green New Deal. And the important point this guy makes, it's called A People's Green New Deal, is the issue of the climate and ecological debt that the rich countries owe to the poor countries. And if we don't address that, we're not going to address climate change, because that's the global Green New Deal. The northern countries have emitted most of the carbon, and also by exporting or importing raw materials have destroyed biodiversity, particularly rainforests or forests in the global south, which has also contributed to global warming in a major way. So the climate debt has to be paid to restore those ecosystems, the forests, the mangroves, the wetlands, and carbon-rich soils, as opposed to industrialized agriculture. So often a forest will be chopped down and end up plant a palm oil plantation, which doesn't rebuild the soils, doesn't bring that much carbon out of the atmosphere into the biosphere. So paying that carbon debt has got to be a major part of a global Green New Deal. And this guy in his book, The People's Green New Deal, that's a point he emphasizes. I completely agree with him. And I think the way to think of it, it is a debt, but it's also an investment in the habitability of the whole planet for all of us. So I don't think we should think of it as, reluctantly paying off something we owe. It's really investing in our future for all of us. So I would recommend The People's Green New Deal. Is a good book. It's the only book on the Green New Deal in the literature I've seen that actually mentions the eco-socialist Green New Deal that I ran on. He doesn't discuss it. He mentions it up front. He also mentions a couple times the Green Party's Green New Deal, which alone among the Green New Deals that even the European Greens are talking about, but also, the progressive Democrats like AOC and Markey, we're the only ones saying cut the military budget, end imperialism, in order to get to the kind of system change we need. So he gives us props for that. So I think, that's a book I just finished, and I would recommend it. And I could go on books, but maybe we should get to the next question. Braden Krause, Howie Hawkins, what are your feelings on the TERFs making a stand in the UK? Yeah, I really think it's bizarre, because these people claim to be radical feminists on the left, and they're actually blocking with the far right in the culture wars. They're in coalition with them. So, whenever you see this stuff come up, you look at what they're advocating, and they're advocating what the Republicans are doing in a lot of these states with these laws to, ban trans women from participating in, sports and in elementary and high school, access to, restroom facilities. I mean, they're getting into business they should have no business. I support trans rights as human rights. I don't see them in conflict with women's rights like these so-called TERFs do. And I support the Equality Act, which would give women as a sex class, but also people based on their sexual orientation, their gender identity, or their intersex status, full protection in federal civil rights and anti-discrimination laws. And that's what we should be supporting. So some of this is leaked over to the United States from these people in the UK, and I think it's shameful. Deborah Sousa Oliveira, Howie Hawkins, why do some Greens leave the Green Party to run as a Democrat. What do you think about that? Well, some of them think they might get elected, and sometimes they do. But the question is, are you just trying to get yourself into office, or are you trying to make some social changes? And I think those Greens that leave to run as Democrats because of personal ambitions, good riddance, frankly, because that's what the Democrats are. They're in it for themselves. I mean, just look at this democracy crisis. Most of those Democrats in Congress, their seats are going to be safe. They're just figuring, okay, the Republicans take back the House. I still got my House seat. I'm still going to get paid. And when I retire, there'll be some corporations wanting to be a lobbyist to pay me even more. So, that's that party. Let those people go to that party. Now, some people think, well, the Greens aren't winning races, and we got to get people in office. And that's true. But I think the way to do that is, first of all, we do win races. We have over 100 Greens elected, and we can turn that into thousands, particularly at the local level. And we build a base there, and then we can get into state legislatures, and from there into Congress. So it's about building a base and running good campaigns. And then it's about changing the rules from single member plurality to ranked choice voting for executive offices, which solves the spoiler problem, and ranked choice voting for multi-member districts. You get proportional representation, which solves the winner-take-all problem. So we get our fair share of representation. So we fight for those things, and then we will get Greens in office, more Greens in office. And I think that's what we need to talk to people that think, well, there are a lot of good people. They went with Bernie Sanders. They thought he might win the Democratic primary for president. They thought that was the best shot for change. Well, we need to talk to those folks. What did the Democratic Party do? The whole leadership closed ranks against Bernie Sanders to make sure he wouldn't be the nominee. Okay, what does that tell you? You're not going to reform the Democratic Party. That is one of the two capitalist parties that the business interests support, and they're not going to let you take it over. We need to build our own party. So I think that's what we need to say to some people that, maybe for good motives, went with the Democrats in recent years, but now they've got 5 years of Sanders. And one thing to realize about Bernie Sanders, he won like 16 elections running as an independent. Mayor of Burlington, the House of Representatives many times, the Senate a few times. When he lost his win, he ran as a Democrat. So who says you can't win as an independent? Bernie Sanders proves the opposite. Andy Messick, do you think going back to the old super socialist style of making sure our campaign, our local issue, bread and butter campaigns, where we connect directly to people's lives, is a good idea? I do. Now, sewer socialism can mean they abandon the bigger goals of socialism, but those were local, Socialist Party campaigns. Milwaukee's the most famous example. And building the sewers was a major public health advance, saved many people's lives from all kinds of disease. So that was, building public infrastructure. And that's the way local elections are. People, they're worried about potholes. They're worried about crime. They're worried about affordable housing. They're worried about the treatment by the police. They're worried about whether the schools are educating their children. And those are the kind of issues in local elections we should be better at. Because from what I've seen, not just in my own city, but around the country, the Democrats and Republicans, but it's mostly Democrats in the cities, they don't have a program. They really don't. They basically inherit the nomination, and because the elections aren't competitive, they waltz into office. Real estate industry funds most of the campaigns, so they do the bidding of the real estate industry, which just makes things worse. I mean, real estate's responsible for the sprawl development, racial segregation, not enough affordable housing. So we can come in there with real issues. And in my experience, when I've run local races, Democrats can't deal with it because they haven't even thought through the policies. So yeah, those are the issues. And we got to find out what they are, not just by thinking amongst ourselves, but going out and talking to people. This is that deep canvassing or relational organizing I've been talking about. Go out, knock on doors in communities that you think ought to be part of the supporting the Green Party, but maybe aren't, and listen, hear what their grievances are, what their issues are. And after you've had, conversation for a while, you can relate what they're saying to your platform, and then be consistently active in the community so people see that you're just not there for one time. That's how we build a base, and that's how we find out what those bread and butter issues are for people. I went into, this was a statewide campaign, and this was for governor, and we had our Green New Deal, we had our progressive tax reform, we had several issues. But what I found once I got talking to voters was the high stakes testing and charter school privatization, huge issue that I was aware of, but I didn't realize how big it was. But once I got out there talking to people, yeah, it was a major issue. So, find out what people's issues are and then speak to them. And the hour's up. So, I was excited to hear from Nigeria and Spain. I'm glad people, I guess, around the world are listening in. And we do need to build international solidarity. I'm definitely going to find out more about what's going on in this left-green movement in Nigeria and more about Spain. And then I would say, don't get discouraged. You look at what Congress is doing or not doing, and it's discouraging. But like I said at the beginning, there are fights we can engage and win right now in getting ranked choice voting. And there, I think, where our contribution needs to be is when we talk about city councils, county boards, state legislatures, we want multi-seat ranked choice voting to get proportional representation. That's the game changer. Give you an example. Australian Greens are a 10% party. They have single member ranked choice voting for their House of Representatives. Out of 151 seats in 2019, the Greens got 10.4% of the first ranked votes across the country. They only got one of 151 seats. On the Senate side, on the other hand, it's proportional ranked choice voting, multi-member districts. The Greens got 10.2% of the vote in first round Senate votes, but they got 9 of 76 seats, which is 11.8%, close to proportional. So you can see the difference. If we just have single member ranked choice voting from single member districts, not much will change. And the ranked choice voting movement is thinking, well, we can get the single member district, it's easier to get. Yeah, but do we want to get something easier or do we want real change? So I think that's an area where Greens can make a contribution. And then on the climate issues, it depends on where you are, but, support these fights against the Dakota Access Pipeline, Image Line 3, Image Line 5, and these others. There's fossil fuel infrastructure projects all over the country. We got to fight them. New gas-fired power plants. What was I reading today? Oh, yeah. We have a so-called climate action panel in New York State, and the governor and the legislature appointed its members. It's filled with fossil fuel industry, particularly gas industry people. So we got to fight them here in New York. Wherever you are, there are those kind of fights, and we can win them. We've been winning them. So I guess my message is, watch the national news, follow it, speak out about it, but then there are fights we can get in and win, and let's do that. So everybody have a good week, and see you next week.